Thank you all for being here. Jennifer Govern, who organizes the book talks, apologized that she couldn't be here because there's 2 book talks scheduled right now. So we are going to do our own introductions, and we're going to keep it fairly as a discussion. And so first of all, welcome. My name is Lalitha Vasudevan, and along with Tiffany DeJanes, we are the co-editors of this volume called Arts, Media, and Justice, which is what has brought us all together here today. And just by way of introduction for what we're going to try to do today, what we'd like to do is bring to life some of the voices that are in this book. And so we're going to do part reading, part discussion, and we'd just love to engage in a conversation with you. And so there are, if I'm remembering correctly, 10 chapters. A wonderful foreword by Glenda Hall, and a wonderful afterword by Yolanda Seeley Ruiz. And we have 1, 2, 3, hopefully 4 of the chapter authors who will be joining us today as well. Some of them are far-flung or ill or a combination of the 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with just a little bit of an intro to the book and read from the first 3 chapters, and then allow some time for just discussion, anything you want to build on, talk about, raise questions for us, and then we'll read from a few more, and then we'll go on like that. For the people who aren't here, Tiffany and I and some of the authors are going to read for them, just so you get a real sense of some of the range and variation that's in the book. I want to say 2 things by way of introduction, just in terms of how this particular collection came into being. The first is that it really, for me, represents a really exciting chance to bring together people I care about deeply. Not only the authors in the book, but the people who are represented in the book. And it represents a relationship that I've had with an alternative to incarceration and an alternative to detention program here in New York City for 9 years now. And the other thing I want to say, and the folks here have heard me say this several times, promoting your own work is very awkward. But I am promoting this heavily because all of the proceeds go to the alternative to incarceration and detention programs that are represented in the book. So we're happily promoting it. There's flyers there. Tell your friends, all that good stuff. So I think the only other thing I wanted to do by way of introduction is say one last thing, which is who is represented in this book are current TC graduate students, former TC graduate students, teachers who worked at the ATI program, one of whom is here, who's a graduate student at John Jay College. Another person is a graduate student at Penn. So I think it's kind of interesting and fun that we have blurred in really, I think, important ways the relationships between community-based organizations and the university, and hopefully in productive ways. And then we also have represented in the book Olga Hubbard, who is not here, but she's an art educator. We have Eric Fernandez, who is hopefully coming, who was a young person who participated in some of the projects you'll hear about, but then also has become a collaborator and research assistant with the work. And I think that's all I want to say by way of introduction, and just let you hear some of what's happening. All right, so Tiffany's going to kick us off with a little bit from the foreword.
The foreword is entitled Visible Youth, and it's by Glenda Hall. More than half a century ago, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man brought to greater consciousness the invisibility of being African American in the United States. I am invisible, Ellison's narrator explained, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. If much has changed, a great deal has remained the same. In a recent book on mass incarceration in the U.S., Pettit adapted Ellison's title to call attention to how social science research over the last 50 years has continued to render African American men invisible. In this instance, the failure to see has been the product of data collection infrastructure that has systematically undercounted incarcerated persons, thereby concealing the true extent of continuing decades and repeated generations of racial inequity. How difficult we find it, individuals, citizens, and societies, to stand outside received perception, to escape customary ways of seeing or not, to open our eyes to alternate impressions of events, people, history, and possibility. In Arts, Media, and Justice, Multimodal Explorations with Youth, the contributors, in effect, take as their project to teach us to see more clearly, making visible youthful populations that customarily reside, for most people, either in the institutional shadows of group homes, the court system and detention centers, or in the stark light shown by media to feed a societal fascination with youthful deviance. The authors do in fact teach us, not didactically, but through persuasive illustration, via a kind of ethical synecdoche. They reveal how the youth themselves learn to see, inventing senses of who they can become, and by representing and enacting those possible selves consciously and artfully. And just a smidge more that I want to share. I locate this book in a different and productive scholarly and activist tradition. Theirs is hopeful and forward-looking book, alert and alive with second chance philosophies and traditions. And as Lalitha shared, their authors tell the stories of youth, teachers, and community workers who are, in the face of difficult circumstances and serious constraints, limit situations, as Ferre would say, envisioning new trajectories. The notion of a second chance, wrote Dan Imbar, is derived from the basic belief that everyone has the right to attempt success and mobility, the right to try again, to choose a different way, and that failures should not be regarded as final. What a wonderful idea, a democratic idea, this notion that we all have the right to change our minds, to try a new path, and to set out again.
Aurum has to leave at 4, so I'm going to actually let her read. We're going out of order. The other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that the data, if you will, that's represented and that has been engaged throughout the book comes from 2 participatory research projects. One, which is called Education in Between, which was located as a 5-year participatory ethnographic project at a program that we call Journeys. And the second one is an ongoing project that is at an alternative to incarceration program called Reimagining. No, the program isn't called Reimagining Futures. The project is called Reimagining Futures at a program we call Voices. And Aurum does some work as part of the Reimagining Futures work. So I'm going to skip ahead to Aurum so she can hear her.
So this is excerpt from one of my field notes and my analysis. The field notes below show how the boys began using this project as a way to interact with members of the community and me. We click on our steps when we notice that some of the boys in the middle of the line have stopped while crossing the street to show each other pictures from their cameras. Fearing for their safety, we nudge them to move along and remind them to stand on the sidewalk if they're going to stop. The pictures in the camera vary from neighborhood murals to street signs to fruits from a nearby grocery store to people who live in the neighborhood. A couple of youth stick to a theme, and one boy in particular, Mika, take pictures of senior citizens. At times, Mika stops to ask questions about their lives. When Mika shows us the photo that he has taken, I am speechless. His shots are so poignant. In the close-up portraits are highly biographical images where Mika's muses seem as if they are getting ready to share stories about themselves, which in many cases they did. The focus on themes seems to resonate with the type of stories that these participants would like to present about the neighborhood. Prior to this project, I knew Mika as a funny young man who liked to tell jokes and entertain us with stories of his school life and his neighborhood. During the community walk, he made visible a serious side that I had not seen before. His focus on using portraits as a way of capturing the neighborhood was also highlighted by his interviews with his subjects. When asking some of the elders he encountered about their past and their history in the neighborhood, Mika responded by relating their life stories to his own. Through shared storytelling, he was identifying with these neighborhood senior citizens. At one point, while talking to one elderly man, he recalled his family history and his connection to his own neighborhood. From my vantage point several feet away, I could hear Mika discussing where he was from, the reason he was involved in this community walk project, and other details relevant to his interests.
I'm going to just pick up on that a little bit and read a little bit from our introduction that'll touch, I think, on what both Tiffany and Arm read. So the introduction opens with an epigraph by Vivian Paley that says, "The key is curiosity, and it is curiosity, not answers, that we model. As we seek to learn more about a child, we demonstrate the acts of observing, listening, questioning, and wondering." So this introduction, which is titled "Becoming Not Yet, Adolescents Making and Remaking Themselves in Artful Spaces," we begin this way. We say that this is a book about hopefulness. Each chapter is penned by authors who care deeply about children and youth, whose lives intersect with those of young people in myriad ways inside and outside of formal institutional settings. All of the contributors to the volume also reflect and espouse a commitment to a view of young people as engaged learners that resonates with Paley's words in the opening epigraph, rather than the troubling view of adolescence, which Lesko describes as being derived from persistent and deficit cultural construction of adolescents and teenagers in particular. So she writes, "Typically, teenagers appear in our cultural talk as synonymous with crazed hormones, as delinquents, deficiencies, or clowns. That is, beings not to be taken too seriously. They are most often spoke of with familiarity, sometimes with affection, and regularly with some hostility or displeasure. Contrast this view, so sedimented in ample cultural tropes and texts, some of which we discuss below, with Paley's comment in the same article from which the epigraph comes about an educator's response to a child, any child. In the example below, the child is Frederick, who has introduced the topic of his mother's birthday into classroom talk. Any serious observation," Paley says, "made about a birthday is worth following up, not in order to give Frederick the facts and close the subject, but to use this compelling material as a vehicle for examining his ideas of how the world works. If I am to know Frederick, I must understand, among many other things, how he perceives his mother's birthday and his grandfather's permanence." Paley is responsive and expresses a desire to take a young person and his, quote, "ideas of how the world works" seriously. The chasm between this attentive and respectful engagement with youth and Lesko's astute depiction of the persistent mischaracterizations of adolescence, which reverberate multiplicatively in research and policy that has court-involved youth as its focus, is a departure point for our introduction to this volume. So if you'll indulge me, I'll read just one more bit of it. And this is near the end of the introduction. So this book does not provide summative or definitive prescriptions. Found in these pages are beginnings, initiations of dialogues through portraits of artful engagements that we hope will spill over into readers' ongoing inquiries and emerge re-envisioned in their curricular or research practices. We believe, much as Graham Sullivan asserts here, art can reveal what we don't know by changing what we do know. Therefore, looking forward so as to look again at the past and present requires a creative capacity to reveal a critical insight, and this is within the reach of communities open to imaginative collaborative action. For as Maxine Greene said, art can't change the world, but it can change someone who can. When an invitation to curiosity is taken up, it awakens a new awareness of the possibility to see things differently and to act on the urge to do something about that vision. Thus, this book has grown out of ongoing conversations, conference presentations, and multi-level mentorship between and across researchers and participants, adults and youth, graduate students and youth researchers, and faculty and graduate students. The authors engage in we engage in in an active juxtaposition of positionalities, such as practitioners and researchers and youth participants. In this way, interdisciplinarity is both method and pedagogy that serves as the guiding force behind the collective effort out of which this collection was born. all of us have in some way collaborated in the research and documentation, implementation, and representation of the projects that are at the heart of this volume. And together, we hope the conversation continues. So I think maybe we'll skip to Melanie and then go with and we are joined by Eric Fernandez, who's also one of the authors.
So my name is Melanie, and I was involved with Reimagining Futures for almost 3 years, I would say. It was a great experience. And I'm going to read an excerpt from a workshop I did that was a video production workshop where we kind of created this improvisational horror movie without very much thought or pre-planning or scripting ahead of time. And so we filmed scenes of Isaac discovering the dead body of Darius, which the group found entertaining. Similar to the first scene, there were several takes because one or both kept laughing. Much of the humor derived from Isaac's performances of discovering the dead Darius, where he would dramatically begin screaming, "Oh my God, help!" while fervently shaking Darius. These scenes often dissolved into fits of laughter. Directing and negotiating amongst themselves, Isaac and Darius decided to do a scene where they switched roles to see if it would be easier if Darius discovered a dead Isaac. The participants filmed 2 versions of the reversed scene, which also deteriorated by their inability to keep straight faces. So they decided to revert to the original scenario. The 2 participants shared authority in these role decisions. After Darius laughed a few times while playing the dead body, leading to retakes, Isaac said, "Come on, man," and suggested that he would play the role of the dead body. Darius agreed, although after Eric reprised the role of the corpse, he also realized he could not help cracking a smile. Darius asserted, "See, it's hard." Isaac agreed, and then wordlessly, without any discussion, the acting roles were reinstated. I realize this might be kind of hard to visualize, so I wish I had the video, but basically they were like switching back and forth between who was the dead body. This is another instance where the participants were able to experiment through trial and error with their various roles in a space and context of low stakes, where a scene can fail, yet be repeated and revised through switching characters, changing dialogue, and modifying body language. This experimentation emerged in the moment with changes negotiated amongst the participants without any adult input. This is a space that is collaborative, where multiple participants were able to voice their comments and opinions without fear of retribution. The amount of laughter speaks to the factor of play in this activity. And it is possible that this type of multimodal play, one that is trial and error with low stakes, has particular relevance to this population who are in a program allowing for a sort of retake based on their arrests.
So we want to pause and just give you a chance to either make any observations or raise any questions for the folks who share, and we'll just keep going. We can keep going.
Before, so what did you have in mind? What was your sort of customer thinking when you got started working with this thing? What did you want to learn from this experience? Any one of you, or all of you?
Well, I knew that I had a really broad question, which is sort of like what happens when kids have, technology and arts tools. Just a very ground up sort of question, like what happens when you give kids a video camera and an hour to create something. So that was sort of at least my entryway into this.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, just in response to that, there were a couple of ways that, so I'm Dan. Gabriel and I wrote chapter 7.
We haven't gotten to it.
No, we haven't read yet, but, just on this sort of theme of interdisciplinarity, we were the practitioners originally on this project. Gabriel and I devised the project and carried it through for a couple of cycles. And looking back on it, we were both looking back on it after entering entering PhD programs, Gabriel in education and myself in criminal justice. So in part it was a retrospective through a different lens. When we had originally started the project, obviously we were very immersed in it, and having Lalitha there and our ongoing dialogue with Lalitha and the other researchers involved gave us an opportunity to sort of step back and look at the project as something, from a slightly different perspective, but still we were in the middle of it at that time. And this is about 3-4 years after the project that we were able to do this retrospective. So I think what we really wanted to do at that point in time was kind of contextualize what it was that we had done and figure out what it was about the project that worked within the institutional context in which it was situated, and what didn't work, and how the tension between the project and our intentions with the project and the participants' intentions with the project, how that tension played out with the institution and its intentions for the project. So that was our approach.
There's just, I always think about this when I read Dan and Gabe's chapter, and the theater project that they devised and initiated at Journeys is one that I love. Eric participated in it, and I had so much fun being a part of it as a documenter. And it's really interesting to really, especially talk with Dan and Gabe about it because of their relationship to the organization and their intentionalities. And as a person who was a little bit on the outside, seeing all of the wonderful things, and all of the possibilities. And I think that there's a really lovely tension there between how you're situated as a practitioner in relation to an institution opens up or makes you see things that, someone who spends a lot of time reading about all the things that aren't happening is brought to see. So I think it was for me anyway, it was a really good collaboration. Ongoing.
I would agree with that. And I would say as a practitioner, the theater project that we worked on there was really defining work. It sort of felt like when the project ended, there was really nowhere to go except, looking back on it still sort of feels that way. I feel like it was a defining project for me as a practitioner, but it ended for a reason. And I think one of the things that we were trying to figure out in writing this retrospective was what were the institutional reasons for why it ended. Why were we not still doing it rather than being grad students?
So that might be a nice segue, actually, to you reading a bit.
Absolutely. I think the passage that I picked out here is really more on the theme of visibility and self-revelation than it is on that sort of institutional tension, I think, because that's where we started off. I want to dive into this, and we can look at some other pieces later in response to some questions. This was a devised theater project, so we started out with improvisation. In every cycle we started out with some improvisational training, and then our composition process was improvisational as well. So that was really the building blocks of what we were doing were improvisational. So I think that contextualizes it. Often in our workshop sessions, I'm on page 119 for those who have the book. Often in our workshop sessions, the young men, our participants were mostly male, would initially resist the games. Contorting their bodies into often ridiculous positions or enunciating gibberish words seemed ridiculous to them, and belied the consistently guarded and tough veneers they represented through their stances, clothing choices, and verbal repertoires. Still, the process of shedding norms, either in these often quite comical games or in the more serious improvisational exercises, which we won't get to in more detail in a moment, Read the chapter, you will. Created an opportunity for participants to break away from the selves they felt constrained to portray in their daily lives. Take RJ's comment, for example. You know, I'm a humble person. I feel that it's hard. I feel that I don't always portray who I am. I feel like, you know, being a man and being in Brooklyn, I have to not portray something different, but I have to show a different side because I don't want to be taken advantage of. RJ clearly expresses that being a young man in Brooklyn forces him to represent a personhood that does not reflect who he really is. RJ portrays himself as a humble person who is not able to reveal his humility, or as he says later in this interview, that he is a fun person. However, while the games offered a chance for youth participants to break from convention, the games alone would not have been enough for participants like RJ to find opportunities for new means of representation that allowed them to be humble and fun within the context of street. This possibility of breaking from conventions within a particular context, even if the context was itself a recreation or representation, required improvisation. Still, the work with participants' bodies as a means to develop physical awareness was clearly important as a first step.
Eric, do you want to pick up on any?
Do you want me to read or?
Yeah.
So I'm Eric Fernandez, and I've been a research assistant under the legal for some time now. It's been, 5-6 years. I was a baby when I started, but I'll read. This is under, I guess, it's kind of the second page, page 79, the third page or whatever. I wrote down, in my experience working with at-risk youth in the child welfare system, ranging from alternative detention programs to foster care, youth are taught to be over-reliant on other people in their lives, which can be counterproductive. Youth often lack sufficient knowledge of the skills associated with communication and independence. Youth within urban communities are not always capable of communicating what their needs are, which results in allowing others to do for them. Does that make sense? This is counterintuitive to the possibility of success in the lives of youth. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. The unfamiliarity of having a steady support system, it can be direct family or a committed and dedicated adult figure, causes subconscious inappropriate behaviors, the kind that cause youth to become involved with family courts. It's becoming clear to me that youth use selfishness for survival, as well as a cry for attention. Again, the lack of communication skills allows a buildup of stress and negative thoughts, which result in acting out and committing aggressive stunts as a way of filling in the gaps in their lives. I strongly believe the familiar adage that what children see, they are bound to follow. I have learned this is a way of life for youth, especially those who feel disadvantaged. This, to me, says the youth are always looking for validation as to what's right or wrong. Once a youth gets a sense that something is okay, it's difficult for them to unlearn what is their norm. However, it's not impossible. Often youth find themselves questioning whether this is how life is meant to be. All that comes about are questions. And unfortunately, the youth has no questions with someone, has no connection, with someone who can intervene and challenge this entrenched way of thinking. As it happens with all of us, youth grow into a world where they prefer to stick with what they know, to hold on to familiarity with much uncertainty. Just one more paragraph, sorry. Fortunately enough, sometimes youth are allowed the chance to try new things and even hear positive reinforcements for their experimentation with new ideas. Youth may become acquainted with, either by teaching themselves or by being taught by someone else, different ways to express themselves and tell their stories. And this is where art is used in powerful ways. In some form or another, We all use art as an extension of what we feel inside. This can be singing, writing, dancing, video production, etc. As one who works directly with youth, and as one who has experienced this transformative power of art making, I believe art is essential to youth development, and it is already important to younger generations. I'll stop right there.
I think that might be a beautiful point for me to read. I remember when Tiffany and Lalitha came to me and gave the generous offer to write the afterword, and I think I said, "Are you sure?" Right? Right? So I was thinking, because I was not part of these amazing programs, I was thinking, well, why would they ask me? And so it took me into a moment of reflection to think about the work that I do with young people, and at that time, still being in a high school. And after I read these chapters, I was so touched and felt so blessed to be able to know that these programs exist. And I saw myself in some ways within the work that the facilitators were doing, because this was some of the work that I said, okay, this is what I do in my high school classroom. This is what I hope for the teachers at Teachers College to think about when they go into their English classrooms, right? To engage youth in this way. And so that's my introduction to this, and thank you all for being here. In this book are narratives of yearning, being, and knowing. The youth and the program facilitators use art and play for self and societal exploration and engage in curriculum and pedagogy which centers art, emphasizes community, and uses storytelling and play towards the goals of self-discovery and preventing the youth from recycling in and out of the criminal justice system. This volume eloquently serves as a response to the narrowing of curriculum in schools and the limited ways in which court-involved youth are framed in classrooms and society. Through centering play in multimodal, digitally mediated spaces, these youth are recast in a whole new light, presenting themselves as artists and inviting us to be the audience to their work. Through a meshing of public and private worlds, from writing fan fiction to the improvisation of everyday life events, the work presented in this volume displays a range and seemingly indefatigable examples of engaging youth in meaningful discourse about the world around them. The performances use the languages of joy, of anger, of frustration, vulnerability, and hope to confront stereotypes about people marginalized in American society. The display of honesty and vulnerability on the part of the young people and their program facilitators in telling their stories is what distinguishes this work and therefore marks this text as different and noteworthy.
So that might be a nice point to open it up again for some discussion. Anything people want to pick up on, ask about, ask more about?
I'm kind of playing dumb a little bit, but I think I would, just having you all here, I think it would be interesting to hear. Just curious about how you framed, and I know, Dan, you just talked about, kind of writing this in retrospect, but other people have kind of done it in real time. So I'm just curious how you framed it or presented it or talked about this with the young people that you were working with. And if there was kind of like a main, not strategy, but, approach that you all took similar, or a similar approach, or if you kind of dealt with it in your own ways, but just curious about the discussion around that with young people.
That's like the central, or one of the central questions of how you enter a context, right? And I'll say a little bit, but I want to hear from these folks. Both of the projects, Education in Between and Reimagining Futures, they take as an approach, a participatory ethnographic approach. And for me, what that has always meant is to initiate myself in relationship to a context as a learner, as someone who is really interested in what's happening, but tries not to come with a bunch of preconceived notions. And so one of my favorite stories to tell is how I first arrived at Journeys, which is the program where Dan taught. I was about to say Dave because in other articles, his pseudonym is Dave. So there I just spilled the beans. What I was here as a postdoc at Teachers College, and I'll never forget this, in front of what was then still Main Hall, 3rd floor in the curriculum and teaching department, I had a passing conversation, it happened in passing, about like 20 seconds, with somebody, I don't know who she was at this point, who was I think an advanced doctoral student, and I said, oh, someone told me that you might know someone who works with young people in the justice system. She said, you know who you should talk to? Doris Santoro. And that was it. So I emailed this woman, Doris Santoro, who was a philosophy student. And she said, you know who you should talk to? Murphy, who's down at this program. I said, great. I emailed this character, Murphy. And we had about 4 or 5 emails. And then I finally got down to Journeys. And we had had enough of an exchange that as soon as he saw me approaching, actually I saw Gabriel first. Gabriel had long dreadlocks at that point. He had this big turban on. And so he just sort of looked at me like, who's this person coming into our space? Murphy came out and gave me this great big hug. And so that to me was what this program has always been. It's been a place where people who care deeply about young people find themselves. And I was allowed to be another person who cared deeply about young people. The other tension, though, was, I think the idea of research brings with it a framework of surveillance, and it was really good for me to practice describing what I meant by research, which was grounded in narrative, grounded in storytelling, grounded in dialogues, grounded in, relationships, and not always, and very messy. So that's just sort of a broad.
I think very briefly, as you said, this was retrospective for me, so I'm not in contact with very many of the participants. But just to sort of back up what Lalitha was saying, if you look at our chapter, and then some of the other chapters as well, what you're seeing as evidence is really, it's not just field notes, it's also narrative directly from the plays themselves. And these were collaborative projects, they were all co-written. We had a playwright who was there and was a contributor to this volume, but he was really there to sort of record what we were doing in improvisations, to propose narrative structure, and the process was as democratic as it could possibly be. And in fact, it's something that we treat in the chapter. There was one moment that I felt like was really a defining moment for the project itself, where we did impose a sort of a narrative decision on one of the plays, and it was telling what that did to the process and what that the response that got from our participants. They questioned it, we justified it as best we could, but we learned from that for the next play that we put on for the next cycle.
I feel like you need to tell them.
I need to tell them.
I feel like you do.
Which part?
Don't you want to know what the ending was, but then what it became?
Sure. If you read the chapter.
I can do a short version if you want.
Sure. It's in here. It's all in there.
You're talking about the scene where they don't.
Right.
Okay. So, Bird's Eye View, which was the first play that was co-authored by the Theater Initiative group. There's a scene, it's the penultimate scene, I think, and these 2 young men who are friends with another young man who is sitting and sleeping on a bench approach him. They've been told to get rid of him. And what they do instead is, in the play, they're wearing masks to signify their hustler personalities, and they take the masks off and they see their childhood friend sitting there and they say, forget it, we're not going to do it. And that would, the reason I wanted to just give you a little bit of a context for what Dan was talking about was because I remember one young man who described that process. He was one of the people, along with Eric, who made the decision not to commit this crime against their childhood friend in the play. And when he was talking about it, he said, that would never have happened. That's not reality. You don't not do it. But then he talked about what it opened up to be invited to think about an alternative ending that was about kinship and childhood friendship. And it is a really interesting thing because that moment, I know I've written about it and I've read it and I've thought about it in really interesting, in a variety of ways, and I know Dan and Gabe have written and thought about it in different ways.
I mean, I think for the purposes of the play, it made for a very cathartic moment. It made the play very popular with, the institution, because it fit very well with their sort of redemption narrative that was sort of central to the identity of the institution itself, the Alternative to Incarceration program. I think it raised the status of the program within the organization as well. It was really a nice moment in a lot of ways. But the fact that it wasn't sort of genuine, that it did not arise from the process in the way that the rest of the material did, was problematic in a lot of ways. And when we went back to the process for the next cycle, we sort of resolved not to do that again, not to impose our own needs or desires or moral framework on the narrative. And it became a very different piece, much darker, no less rich, and I don't think any less important or illustrative of the lives or interests of the participants, but still much darker and certainly much less popular with the institution. I mean, it was, I think, maybe one of the reasons why, and we explore this in the chapter, but it was one of the reasons why it was the last play that we did. So, there's always a tension there between genuine democratic processes and, what is imposed by, as broadly as societal norms, but also the institutional norms within which you have to work.
I guess I could jump in and out a bit. Just sitting here listening to everybody, I'm just reflecting on everything that's happened over the years. And for me, every time I talk about it, and when I was writing this chapter, I had been emailing back and forth with Letha, and just in awe of what I was writing. It's just, I feel for me, what I wrote in this chapter is just a small piece in terms of what else I have to share with the world. And personally, I'm working on my own book at the moment, but it's just thinking about journeys and all the different programs that I've been involved in and still am affiliated with, especially the theater project. It's important for me, especially where I come from, my background, and where I live at now and things like that. It's important that this story was told in the way it was told. I believe there's still more to it. And I met up with Dan a few months ago, and had this conversation saying, why don't we should re-engage or reproduce this project, because I feel like there's bigger audiences available to who I believe want to hear or see this kind of play, even on Broadway, I'm very creative. Like I have a lot of thoughts going on, but I feel like Bird's Eye View in Brazil, what's the name? It deserves to be spread out more broadly, international, even if that comes to play. And that's kind of what works for me. But hold on, I'm sorry.
I would imagine it's emotional, probably. I mean, I think for me, in some ways, I felt that I, as writing the afterword, just had a chance to peek in. So I had to deal with a lot of that too, about how much are you being a voyeur, right, in the lives of young people and in the lives of the people who worked with them. So I in no way can be in your shoes or anything, but as I'm listening to you, Eric, I'm thinking about how I was processing some of these things, of the things that I read, right, that's within the book, and had to sort of, check myself to make sure that I was being, I don't know, it's emotional. This kind of work is, it's real and it's emotional, and I'm just feeling, I think because I know you, Eric, and because we've had conversations about your time within Journeys and the work that you're doing now with young people, I would imagine that revisiting it in this way.
I mean, I'm sorry to cut you off. It's emotional in a good way, I can say that. It's not like I'm sad or anything. It's just reflecting on all of it. It's kind of surprising, to say the least. But I'm still here. That's what surprises me. Every day that I wake up is like, Malitha's still here, Yolanda's still here, Dan is still here. It's just, like I wrote in the chapter, it's community. I feel like this is a family within itself, even though it's work-related or whatever, it's still a family. Because there's support when you need it. There's a lot of things that has built off of me being engaged in this project.
I can read the short piece. That the pedagogically focused facilitators who authored this text, like the teachers I fondly remember, understand the power and purpose of play as a pedagogical method that fosters deep learning, self-confidence, and self-development. Great teachers of young children understand that play is the primary work of childhood, and great students of life, including the youth and their facilitators, whose narratives grace these pages, embrace and execute what Pat Kane, author, musician, and cultural commentator, tells us. Play will be to the 21st century what work was to the industrial age, our dominant way of knowing, doing, and creating value.
We just love to hear from you, just either thoughts or questions, and we have a little bit of time. I mean, we can read from the other chapters if you'd like to hear that as well. We'll keep it informal and open. Because we didn't want it to feel like a presentation, we wanted it to feel like a dialogue. So.
I'm wondering if you could speak more towards the role of media and the importance of media in youth's lives, and probably it's changed considerably over the past 5 years that you've been engaged with this, and how important it is. I mean, from what you've spoken right now, it was these were in person, these were experiential, and if you could speak to maybe how the role of media is being engaged, and how important it is for these to be in person, or whether you can have the same kind of experiences virtually, and how that might change. I mean, as kids look into boxes, I mean, they're all day long.
Looking at boxes.
Their smartphones and stuff. How important was this for you to be there and present?
Well, I don't know about virtual, I think as far as play goes and creating, I think it is important to have that face-to-face interaction. But one thing I think is interesting is when I was doing some video production workshops, sort of what I sort of would label a literacy that the students already brought to these times, even though they probably didn't have very much experience with using cameras. They would know how to frame a shot, or how you want to close up at certain moments, or do a wide shot at other moments. There have been times when we were shooting with cameras where a battery would die and a student would pull out their cell phone and start using that as a tool for production. So I think that there is a tremendous knowledge that students, or just youth, or people in general right now have regarding media. And the hope would be, things like schools or other more formal places would, perhaps recognize that more and have that be more of a, something that they can produce because it's fun. And I think spend a lot of time on media and they're interested in it. So.
It was also, go ahead.
That question of how important is being there in person. It's essential to the process, I believe, especially the project or whatever situation is happening. The face-to-face, it's important because the youth, especially the population we're working with, they get to see you for who you are. I mean, you're a teacher, you're a youth advocate, you can be whatever title you have, but they get to see you for the person you are. And media, and I'm a big social media guy, it's important because you get to engage with the world, yes, but back to the question of why the face-to-face is important, it's we're human. And they get to see that besides who you portray you are right then and there, they get to engage with you, the laughs, and I always remember that Lolita says messiness is okay, and I'll never can't forget that because it's the truth. Because I'm the type of person who I would get frustrated on why isn't this working, but it is working the way it's supposed to. It's natural, it's organic, it's genuine. So. Yeah.
I think that's really a really good way to put it. We're human. I mean, I was going to start out by saying that the existence of this text sort of in and of itself says to me that presence isn't everything. I mean, I think with these chapters and the way that they sort of take different perspectives on what is, I mean, essentially two projects. We have how many chapters? 3 chapters on the theater project. That's a live theater project, but I think seeing it from this many different perspectives, all written by participants, you do get some sense of what the process entailed, what it was all about. But then I think the flip side of that is, as Eric says, part of, I mean, obviously live theater you can only really appreciate it live, but that idea of being able to see the individuals up on stage, not just as actors or as characters, but as human beings, it was a huge part of why we did it the way that we did and why we framed each performance with a talk back. Because when you have a group that's as invisible as court-involved young people often are to the broader society, I mean, it's so easy to look at something, a creative product that has come out of this context and say, that's great in however many different ways, and sort of objectify the young people who produced it by, holding it up as a testament to a redemption narrative or something along those lines. Unless you have the messy human aspect of it, which you only get with the talkback, which you only get with the live presence and the introduction of the individuals involved as human beings, I'm not sure you're really getting an honest and sort of self-invested portrayal of the young people who are involved. You're getting a product, and I think what you're getting with the live version is you're getting the whole mess that went into it, and you're getting to see the human side of it.
The other thing I just wanted to put in that description is your question, Christine, is a really important one because it's, first of all, media is one of the main titles, the words in the title, and we selected the words intentionally, and so much of the emphasis on the integration of the arts and media in youth programs is on the final product. And what was so compelling about not just the theater initiative, but the work across both organizations was the way that the adults at these organizations are oriented towards the really multiplicative lives of the young people. And so I want to give 2 examples. And one thing that's not in this book is I've written both with both Dan and Eric and Gabriel and Christine, who's not here, and then on my own about the theater project more. So I can send you more stuff if you'd be interested. But I want to give you 2 quick moments, which I think address this sort of messiness and also address this media question. In Bird's Eye View, there's a scene where Eric and another young man engage in it's a funnier play than Brazil, certainly. And so, but right before this sort of goofing off scene, Eric delivers this beautiful, just compelling spoken word performance. And how that came about was, I think some of the other young men who were part of the theater project, and Dan and Gabe heard him just rapping and spitting some rhymes one day. And in the process of the improv, it became part of the improvs they were doing, and it organically became part of the play. And Eric rewrote some of the verses in response, so it was tailor-made for the play a little bit more. Similarly, during the production of Brazil, one of the things I particularly found fascinating, this was going on in the fall of 2008, so it was before, during, and after President Obama's initial election. And so there was a really particular kind of energy around the project that particular season. This group, so Brazil was young men and young women. Anytime there was a break, they would bust out in these old school 80s R&B songs. I was like, were you born when this came out? Thereby dating myself. And what was really fascinating was that became part of the rhythm and the space of the theater project. But what was also complementary was the way that Dan and Todd, who's the playwright in the book, incorporated that into their pedagogy. Like it wasn't, you're off task, stop singing. And I always had recorders and cameras, so I was always interrupting everything and just, doing photo shoots with the kids and all that stuff. So at least they didn't tell me to my face, Letha, you're, really enough with the media. But it became incorporated where, I remember Candace and Tiffany during breaks, they would just sing into the digital voice recorder.
There's actually a piano in one of them.
There was a piano. The video with Brandon and Christian just spontaneously doing a completely unrehearsed duet. So we often, I think, in media education, look at the final product, right? Like what piece of media was produced, or how are kids critically engaging and deconstructing this media text. What was really lovely for me was seeing the organic ways that Dan and Gabe and Todd were oriented towards the mediated lives of young people. So that's a long answer to it.
I'm sorry, just to add on to what Letha just said. I think I can speak for myself and my peers at that time is moments where we can be recorded, it's appreciated because it lets us know that, I'll just keep it at that. It's appreciated because a lot of the times there's a lot of talent, especially in New York, that isn't. I just want to make sure I word this right. There's a lot of talent that's underground and hidden, and moments where, for instance, we can record this and listen to it a week later, especially in rehearsal. There's a sense of joy and happiness, and it's humbling to know that someone wanted to hear this at this time, and then we can go back onto it a week later and listen to it. And I'm remembering we left the rehearsal. I think we had dinner or something, and feeding into what Letha was saying, we were leaving on the way home, on the way to the train, and there was a moment where we kind of broke into groups, and it was myself and Brandon, I believe his name was. We were singing, and then everybody was just singing. I think it was
The day after the election.
yeah. It's so hard to say goodbye, I think it was.
I remember Dan calling and saying, we're not having rehearsal today, everybody's too happy. We're going out for Chinese food. And so Eric was the director's assistant during that second cycle, but he also was a research assistant with our project. And became like super blogger, right? So we had a research blog, and Eric just took to field notes like he'd been doing it forever. And so I wasn't there that day, but I had this vivid image in my mind of these kids linking arms, walking back from the Chinese restaurant to the subway, singing, what was it?
I think it's so hard, boys to men.
Yeah, Boys to Men.
Yeah. Someone to say goodbye.
This kind of work is not done in 5 minutes or even 10 days, but the kind of work that you're talking about, you know, that can be so powerful takes this kind of time. And I think a lot of time we don't give ourselves that time and space to do this work as researchers in the academy. So I thank you, all of you who participated in the work. One thing that I heard from the very beginning come up was, and I think Alika, you said it, and Eric, I heard it in your reading, and then I heard it in your reading as well, Dan, is the ways in which we look at the multiplicity of their lives, and just, you know, how we have very static notions from the media about our young men. And one of the things that I kept hearing is like the emotion, and even when you're talking about other topics, is like the happiness, the joy, the you know, the way that they came out and they had a certain demeanor and playing and learning how to play, and we don't, I don't think we see as much, quote unquote, the emotional side of men to see that aspect of who they are. And when I hear the words or see the words fear and innocence in a fear-based world, it's like, I don't know how much we talk about maybe the fear that young men experience in our world today, and somehow that's glossed over in painting them in different ways that you also mentioned at the beginning of the book. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to the emotion of young men and how it would enable us and enable educators in schools to really see men as just very much multidimensional as opposed to the caricatures we're getting these days.
I guess I did. Hearing you speak is reminding me of the movie. Well, it was actually a book, and it was a moment where the teacher like grabbed the student, like the student was in the classroom fighting. It was a book about a teacher who had a classroom of students, and does anybody remember it? I don't remember it. But
One
the,
wasn't
Narrow down.
I can't remember the name of the book, but I'll probably figure it out. But the student was the class clown, throwing chairs. He was going to get into a fight, but it escalated almost into a fight, but it was broken up by security or whatever. But she took the student outside, and they were talking, and the student broke down. But the student was like very dismissive, like, get away from me, cursing and stuff. She grabbed him and said, I see you. And then he broke down. And it's moments like that where, especially for me doing the work that I do as a youth advocate, confronting their reality, you're broke, you don't have a job, you don't do, what are you gonna do for your future, is, I believe, in my experience, is what hits home for them a lot of the times. And when you confront, what are you going to do about this situation? You have a child coming in. You're living with your mother. You want a job. You want an apartment. You want all these things. But what are you doing for yourself? Really hits home for them. And when you have somebody who's real, I guess you can say, genuine, I want to help you. I'm here for you. I'm a social worker, yeah, I have a degree, whatever. But if I'm here for you. And once they understand that and believe that and see it within the work you're doing, I feel they're better for it. So are you as a worker or whatever the case may be. But just confronting their realities is big, and it can get emotional. Like, and that's for me, especially the work I do. The reason why I do it is because it's real. It's real work for me. Yeah, it's real. It's genuine.
I think you all mentioned the process is very important, and not just the product of these types of efforts. So I think it's, having that book there and being able to discuss is valuable in and of itself. But I was also wondering, as I heard you read and as I heard some of the discussion, who's the intended audience and how will this be used? And a couple ideas popped into my head. My organization, we're running the holiday book drive. And one of the recipient organizations is Green Hope Services for Women in East Harlem. They work with formerly incarcerated women, many of whom have young children. It's a residential facility where they gain additional skills and they have additional supports, and et cetera, et cetera. They're trying to build a better life for themselves and their children. And so I was wondering, from their perspective, from the perspectives of the women in that program, you know, what would they get out of reading something like this? How could that be valuable and useful to them in examining their own experiences and connecting dots or not or what have you? I'm not sure, but it popped in my head. Who are the audiences? How can people use this process and this information in order to advance the work and their own their work and their personal development?
So the question is, who's the intended audience for this work, or who's the intended audience
For the
for?
book.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, so that's.
Because you have a product, what do you?
What do you hope for with it? What do
And
you?
it was valuable to the folks who participated in the process, who, you know, about which the work is, this book was written. But what is the value of this kind of work and how can it be applied to help people?
I'll start with that just a little bit. We've done a lot of playing, thinking about like who would we want to read this, who would we sort of dream to get this in their hands, right? We were thinking, do we want this in the hands of course, academics and educators, right? But do we also want to get it in the hands of judges and in the hands of people actually doing this work and working with the young people whose stories have been represented in it?
Or other young people themselves,
Yeah, or
right?
young people
Or
themselves,
young
exactly,
people who are
exactly.
maybe headed in a certain direction. You know, how could they, I was thinking about my mentee, and he goes through a tough time, and if he's a young guy, but, you know, if he doesn't get the kind of support he needs, and the opportunities he needs, and, you know, he could find himself in some more serious trouble. So how can you use this for folks who maybe been through the system, who are maybe headed in a particular direction? How can you apply this to help people?
You know, I think what Joe is bringing up, sort of going back to my years in marketing, right? But marketing with a purpose and marketing with the intent to try to put something in the world that can change someone's lives. And I think it's something for us to think about. How you started out earlier saying, you know, I usually don't want to push something, but, you know, the proceeds are going here and there. But really, when we think about research in general, like, why do we do research? And if it's not done to change someone's life for the better or to open up a possibility of being known differently, then why bother? Right. So I think that it offers, what Joe is asking poses a question for the team in terms of how and where and in what ways can this book be promoted, not for the self-promotion of itself, but do we see that it's like a balm in Gilead in some ways, that some people will pick it up and perhaps see themselves in Eric, you know, see themselves in, for me, just knowing that programs like this existed. Believe it or not, having taught for 20 years, and I read it and I'm like, huh? So part of that knowledge of, yes, these things exist and they're making an impact, and I'm not alone in the world because someone else, like an Eric or some of the other folks, have gone through what I'm going through. So I think that you just opened up. I don't want to speak because I came in afterwards, but that's so key. Like, how does this live in the world? The silver.
The other, I mean, I just wanted to build on what Yolanda said and what Tiffany was just saying too, in terms of, you know, envisioned ideal audiences, and then sort of the unexpected ways that this might live beyond, you know, a static text. And I think actually both Glinda and Yolanda picked this up in their forward and afterward respectively, which was lovely to see because it was something with which the book was conceived, and it was nice to see that they both came out and saw it. It's this idea of small moments. So much of research that gets published tries to make these large points, right? That if you do X, Y will be stopped, or, you know, and that wasn't the nature of the research that we were doing. And, you know, Melanie talked a little bit about a scene where, you know, there was play around the video making, video production. And one of the things we would talk about in the Reimagining Futures meetings was and continues to be, what are we doing? You know, because we're situated in this organization as both facilitators and researchers. And when we step back, what lives with us are those small moments, not because of where they may take us, but because of what they allow to happen in that moment. And so for us, well, again, for me, and I know when Tiffany and I were going through the chapters and sort of looking across themes and things like that, there were these really distinct patterns of moments of relationship that kept coming through. And so when you mention a specific program, for example, like the program for women, so much of programmatic decisions are based on large-scale outcomes. And so one of our challenges, I think, in our collective work and our respective work, and I'm also thinking of the work that Dan's doing now with insane data sets and thinking about the contrast between that and some of the work he did here, but how might we not, you know, eschew the large-scale outcomes, but how might we keep that in mind while we attend to in a mindful way to the present and small moments? And that to me seems like one important thing to take away from it. But when you also said, you know, how might the young people who are center stage in the text, what might they find in it? I was thinking that this would be it is interesting. I don't know that they were the primary audience. However, I do imagine that it might be really an interesting experience to read it with the young man you're talking about, right? So might you read pieces of it together and have a discussion about, you know, what is the scene happening? And not to do it in a forceful kind of way, but so that's where my head went to when you talked about the young man.
Are there football players in it?
There's baseball.
I get him books
Baseball.
about football, because that's what he loves. He won't read anything but books about
Christine's
sports.
chapter talks about a young man in particular who loves basketball. So
Kobe Bryant, right?
That's
Kobe
right.
Bryant, yeah.
I mean, I'd say, just for our chapter, the intended audience is really practitioners. I mean, sure, it's partially targeted toward an academic audience, but really, I mean, I'd say you are probably the intended audience in a sense, and that what we're trying to explore here is sort of the importance of that personal interaction and giving young people a voice. I mean, we did not approach this as social workers, and we even kind of stepped back from our status as educators to take on this project. It was really about sort of, minimizing our presence as something, as sort of representatives of dominant cultural expectations and allowing narratives to take shape that we didn't see any other space for. And I think, where are the spaces for that in other kinds of work? You have to create a devised theater program from scratch in order to create spaces for young people to express themselves honestly. Not necessarily, but it is worth thinking about what it is in your institutional framework, what it is in your training, what it is in your professional approach that inhibits inhibits clients from honestly expressing their narratives. And it's not that there are professional ways to find out what people need and professional ways to give that to them. That's not what this is about. This is about allowing a kind of expression that I don't think there are a lot of spaces for. So how you do that in the context of your own work, I don't know your work well enough to really speak to that, but it's certainly worth thinking about.
So I'm going to just play a time cop here. We're a couple minutes before 5, but that seems like a nice point to end on. I want to just point you guys to a couple of materials that are on the table. And Emily, if you want to pass out that flyer, that would be super.
The postcards.
And the postcard. One way that the ideas in this work have continued to live on is through a project that was begun about 2.5 years ago called Youth Media and Educational Justice, through collaboration with some folks who are in here. Bill was on our advisory study group. Yolanda and I are part of that project team. And with generous support from the Provost's office that Christine represents, we were able to kick off some initial work where we are trying to bring arts-based and media approaches to the participatory work around engaging young people in both, not only the juvenile justice system where these projects were located, but also the foster care system. Emily's in the second offering of the Youth Media and Educational Justice course here, actually in this room. And so, you know, thank you. Another way that another way to think about the audience for this work is us, ourselves. And then the other thing I want to say, just as a plug to Tiffany and her co-teacher, Ms. Mott, who are high school teachers in Brooklyn High School, is that they're doing qualitative research with teenagers, with high school students, and it's beautiful work. So I know we'll be sitting here at a book talk of theirs soon. But so in terms of who's the audience for this work, Joe, I think this makes me think that we continue to be the audience for this kind of reflective work. So thank you all for being here, and please tell your friends, because we hope the conversation continues.